This is my true story. I spent my life working with my hands, building a future for my daughter. I believed my effort would earn respect, not mockery. But after her wedding, the people who should have welcomed me laughed instead. They whispered about my old suit, about the man who gave everything and looked poor doing it. My daughter said nothing. That night, I made a promise to myself. They would never laugh again. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because this story will stay with you forever. I worked most of my life in silence, without asking for applause or recognition. My hands grew rough, my back bent from years of lifting and building, but my heart stayed full because I was doing it all for my daughter. She was the light that guided me through every long night and every early morning shift. When others slept, I was on the road, working, saving, pushing my body beyond its limits so that she could one day live without worry. I never had much, but I had enough to keep her dreams alive. When she was little, I promised myself she would never see hunger the way I once did. Every coin I earned, I tucked away for her future. I sold a small piece of land I inherited from my father and used that money to send her to school in the city. I walked miles instead of taking buses, ate the simplest food, and wore the same shoes until they tore apart. But every sacrifice felt worth it because it brought her one step closer to a better life. I remember the nights I came home covered in dust, my clothes heavy with sweat. She would run to me, showing me her school report cards, her eyes shining with pride. Those small moments made everything worth it. I didn't care about luxury or comfort. I wanted her to stand tall, to have everything I couldn't. She was my purpose, my only reason to keep moving forward. As the years passed, I watched her grow into a young woman, graceful and intelligent. I told myself that all the pain, the hunger, the sleepless nights, they had built something beautiful. I dreamed of walking her down the aisle someday, not as a tired old man, but as a proud father who had given everything to make her life better. When she met her future husband, I tried my best to welcome him warmly. I wanted her happiness more than anything. He came from a wealthy family, people with polished shoes, expensive watches, and words dipped in pride. I didn't fit into their world, but I didn't care. I believed love didn't need to match bank balances. I thought they would see the man behind the worn clothes, a father who built his daughter's dreams with his bare hands. So when the wedding day came, I wanted to look my best. I couldn't afford a new suit, so I wore my old one, the one I'd worn when she graduated, when I stood clapping in the crowd with tears in my eyes. I cleaned it carefully, polished my old shoes, and ironed my shirt 3 times until not a wrinkle remained. I looked in the mirror and smiled, telling myself, "You did well." That morning, I walked into the grand wedding hall. Lights sparkled, people whispered, laughter filled the air. My daughter looked stunning, radiant in her dress. I felt my chest swell with pride. I thought everyone would see what I saw, not a man in an old suit, but a father standing tall on the foundation of his love and sacrifice. But as I moved through the crowd, I began to notice the looks, the quick glances, the quiet smiles that weren't kind. I could hear the faint laughter when I passed, the whispers behind hands. They weren't looking at me with respect. They were mocking me. My old shoes, my old suit, my simple way of speaking. They saw a poor man pretending to belong. Still, I smiled. I stood straight. I told myself it didn't matter. My daughter's happiness was all that mattered. I reminded myself that I wasn't there for approval, only love. I went to her side, and she didn't meet my eyes. Her husband's parents stood nearby, whispering something to her. She gave a small, uncomfortable smile, pretending not to hear. But I saw it, that flicker of shame. It was small, but it cut deep. I stood alone for most of the ceremony, clapping when others clapped, smiling when I had to. When it was time for photos, I stood at the edge, always a step behind. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. But every time I caught someone laughing, every time someone looked me up and down, I felt a sting that words can't describe. I thought about how many years I worked to make this day possible, every meal I skipped, every night I stayed awake counting money, Every injury I hid because I didn't want her to worry. I gave her everything, and in return, all I got was silence. When the music played, I sat quietly at the back, drinking water while others sipped wine. No one came to sit beside me. I wasn't invisible. I was unwanted. The lights felt too bright, the laughter too loud. I wanted to leave, but I stayed until the end because a father doesn't walk away from his daughter's big day, even when his heart is breaking. When it was finally over, I walked outside alone. The cool night air hit my face, and I could feel the weight of every year I had carried on my shoulders. I looked up at the stars, wondering if my wife was watching from somewhere above. She had always told me that love would heal all wounds, but that night, it didn't. That night, love hurt. I went home quietly, my shoes covered in dust from the road. My old suit felt heavier now, not from fabric, but from shame. I sat by the window, staring into the dark. I could still hear their laughter echoing in my head. The laughter of people who had no idea what sacrifice looked like. But somewhere beneath the pain, a thought began to grow. A quiet thought, a seed planted by humiliation. I realized something important. People like them only respect power, not effort, not honesty, power. And I decided that night, without saying a word, that one day I would make them see what true power looked like. It wouldn't come through anger. It wouldn't come through shouting or tears. It would come through patience, through planning, through the same discipline that built my daughter's life from nothing. That night, I made a promise to myself. They laughed at the man in the old suit. But one day, they would stand in front of him again, not to laugh, but to bow their heads in silence. At the wedding, laughter carried louder than the music. It started as whispers behind fine glassware, gentle enough to sound harmless, but cruel enough to pierce deeper than any insult spoken aloud. I could feel eyes tracing the edges of my old jacket, the one I had worn on the day my daughter was born, the same one I had carefully folded and kept for years, like a piece of my own history. To me, it wasn't a worn jacket. It was a reminder of everything I had built with hard work. To them, it was something to laugh at. Every step I took through that grand hall felt heavier. The chandeliers above shone like the eyes of those who judged me. They weren't laughing because they found joy. They were laughing because they saw a man who didn't belong in their world of wealth and polish. Their words floated like poisoned whispers, quiet enough to pretend kindness, loud enough to ensure I heard every bit of mockery. I saw my daughter standing near the stage. Her head was bowed slightly, her lips pressed together. She could hear them too. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't defend me. For a moment, I thought maybe she hadn't noticed. But then her eyes met mine, and in that silence, I saw everything. Shame, embarrassment, a distance I had never known could exist between father and child. Her husband's parents stood nearby, dressed in clothes that could feed a small family for a month. Their jewels sparkled, their laughter rose and fell like waves crashing against my heart. The mother-in-law whispered something to her husband, both glancing my way, smiling. That kind of smile that hides cruelty behind elegance. I tried not to let it show, tried to keep my back straight. But it's strange how humiliation can bend even the proudest spine. I walked over to congratulate my daughter again, to bless her for her future. But before I could finish speaking, her mother-in-law placed a soft hand on my arm and said with false sweetness, "Please, sir, don't trouble yourself. You should sit down." It was said kindly enough for others to hear, but the tone beneath it told me what she really meant. "You don't belong here." And my daughter said nothing. That silence broke something inside me. Not because I expected gratitude, not because I wanted recognition, but because I had spent every day of my life ensuring that she would never be treated the way they were treating me. And yet, she stood there and let it happen. The laughter continued through the dinner. Each course that arrived at the table reminded me of the nights I had gone to bed hungry, working extra hours so she could eat well. They feasted on things I had never even seen before, but I had no appetite left. The food tasted like dust. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept them hidden under the table. I told myself it would all pass, that one day she would understand the weight of that night. When the photographer called for family pictures, I joined them quietly. As I stood beside my daughter, the photographer adjusted people's positions. "Can the father stand a little further to the left?" he said. And I moved without a word. Further left, further back, until I was almost out of the frame. That's where they wanted me. Somewhere in the background, unseen but present enough to fill the spot of obligation. When the pictures were done, I stepped aside, watching her in her wedding dress, radiant and proud. For a fleeting moment, I saw the little girl who used to run to me after school, the one who would ask me to lift her high enough to touch the ceiling. That image flashed before me, and it was gone, replaced by the woman who now pretended I wasn't there. The speeches began, filled with fancy words about family and pride. Her husband's father spoke at length about success, wealth, and class. He called their union the meeting of two families, but as he spoke, he didn't once look in my direction, as if my family didn't exist. When people clapped, I clapped too, forcing a smile that hurt more than the tears I refused to shed. The music grew louder, and people began to dance. I sat alone, pretending to rest, my hands folded neatly on the table. A few guests approached out of politeness, offering shallow smiles before walking away. No one asked how I was, no one offered me company. It was a room full of people, and yet I had never felt more invisible. When it was time for dinner, I walked toward the buffet. I picked a small plate, took little portions, and sat quietly in a corner. My daughter passed by, her dress brushing against the air beside me, but she didn't stop. She didn't even look down. The laughter of her in-laws followed her like perfume, sweet on the outside, poisonous within. I remember catching a reflection of myself in a decorative mirror nearby. A man with silver hair, a wrinkled suit, and tired eyes. I looked like a ghost, haunting a celebration that wasn't mine. But behind those eyes, something stirred. Not rage, not jealousy, but a kind of awakening. Humiliation, if you let it sink deep enough, becomes fuel. It becomes something sharper than anger, something colder than sadness. It teaches you what silence really means, not weakness, but control. I looked at those people laughing, the same ones who couldn't survive a single day of my life's hardships, and I thought, you see a poor man. You see a simple suit, but you don't see the years behind it. You don't see the calluses, the empty stomachs, the broken sleep, the hands that built something out of nothing. And so, I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just watched, memorizing their faces, their words, their arrogance. Because one day, I told myself, I would stand before them again, and on that day, they would understand who they had mocked. When the ceremony ended, I waited until everyone left the hall. I didn't want goodbyes. I didn't want fake smiles or hollow gestures. I walked outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. My suit jacket flapped in the wind, and I pulled it tighter, not because I was cold, but because I wanted to protect what little dignity I had left. On the way home, I passed by the old street where I used to buy sweets for my daughter when she was young. The shopkeeper recognized me and asked, "How was the wedding?" I smiled faintly and said, "Beautiful." Then I walked away before my voice could break. At home, I placed my suit carefully on the hanger. I looked at it for a long time. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't new, but it had carried me through every milestone of my life. I whispered softly to myself, "They laughed at this suit, but this suit will see them again." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the moon rise slowly above the quiet town. My heart ached, but somewhere inside that ache, a plan was forming. I didn't know when or how, but I knew one day life would give me the chance to balance the scales. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to curse. I just needed to wait, because time, when used wisely, can turn humiliation into power. And when morning came, I didn't wake up with bitterness. I woke up with purpose. That night, I returned home alone. The lights of the wedding hall faded behind me, but the sound of laughter stayed, echoing through my head like a cruel reminder. The stars above were silent witnesses to a father's pain, and the road beneath my feet felt longer than ever before. My shoes were worn, my back ached, but none of that hurt as much as the silence my daughter had chosen. A silence that spoke louder than all the laughter I had endured that day. When I stepped inside my small house, it felt emptier than usual. The clock ticked on the wall, slow and steady, marking every second I had lost. I placed my old suit carefully on the chair and sat beside it. The same chair where my late wife once sat during our evening talks. For a moment, I looked at that chair, and I could almost hear her voice, soft, gentle, full of warmth. She used to tell me that love always returns if it's pure, that a good heart will never be forgotten. But that night, her words felt far away, like something spoken from another life. The quiet of the room was heavy. The laughter from the wedding still clung to me like dust that refused to wash off. I closed my eyes and tried to push it away, but it came back. Their faces, their sneers, the way they looked at my hands, my clothes, my shoes. Every insult, every smirk burned into my memory. I sat there until the clock struck midnight. The room grew colder. I could hear the soft rustle of the curtains in the wind. My stomach ached, not from hunger, but from the emptiness that comes when everything you believed in begins to break apart. I had built my whole life around one dream: to see my daughter happy, to give her everything I never had. And now the same dream had turned into the source of my deepest humiliation. I walked over to the small wooden shelf where I kept my old photographs. There was one from her school graduation. She was smiling, holding her certificate, and I stood beside her in that same suit. I remember that day, how she told me, "Papa, I'll make you proud." I had believed it with all my heart. I still wanted to believe it, even after what had happened. But belief is a fragile thing. It can break quietly, without making a sound. I placed the photograph back and looked around the small house. Every wall, every crack carried a story. Stories of long nights, sacrifices, and love that never asked for anything in return. This house was not rich, but it was honest. It had warmth, the kind that money can't buy. And yet, to those people, none of it mattered. They saw me as less than them because I didn't shine the way they did. I sat back down and closed my eyes again. The night outside was silent, except for the occasional bark of a distant dog and the soft hum of the wind through the trees. My thoughts drifted to my wife again. She had always been my strength. She believed in simple things: kindness, patience, truth. If she had been there that day, she would have spoken up for me. She would have told them that wealth means nothing without respect. But she was gone, and I was left to carry her lessons alone. I poured myself a small glass of water and took a sip. My hands trembled slightly as I held it. Not from age, but from emotion. The humiliation I had swallowed all day was beginning to harden into something else, something sharper, something stronger. It was not anger. Anger burns fast. This was colder, like steel forming in a fire. It was resolve. I realized, as I sat there in the dark, that I couldn't let this be the final chapter of my story. I couldn't let the image of that night, their laughter, my silence, define me. I had worked too hard, given too much, to let mockery be the memory people carried of me. No, I would not fight them with words. I would not shout or demand apologies. I would do something far more powerful. I would make them remember me, not as a poor man in an old suit, but as a man who turned humiliation into victory. As I looked around the room, my eyes fell on the small box of documents under my desk. Inside were old certificates, property deeds, savings accounts, pieces of my life's work. I had forgotten about them. But that night, I pulled the box closer and began to sort through them slowly. My fingers moved across the papers, each one reminding me of a time when I still believed effort and honesty could change the world. I stopped when I found one particular envelope, the sale deed from a piece of land I had sold years ago. The memory came rushing back. I had sold that land to pay for her education, to make sure she could walk into a better life. It was a good trade, I thought back then. I gave up land so she could gain wings. But wings, it seemed, had flown too far from their nest. The night stretched on. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, watching the moonlight shift across the floor, feeling the hours pass like pages turning in a book I no longer recognized. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the pain began to change shape. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was focused. It had purpose now. By morning, I had made up my mind. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew I would not remain the man they mocked. I would not let their laughter echo forever. If life had taught me one thing, it was that silence can be louder than noise, and mine was about to speak. When the first light of dawn touched the curtains, I rose from my chair. My body was tired, but my spirit felt awake for the first time in years. I washed my face, combed my hair, and looked in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't broken. He was quiet, but there was fire in his eyes. I put my old suit back on its hanger, smoothed it out gently, and whispered to myself, "Not yet. One day, you'll wear this again, not for sorrow, but for triumph." Then I opened the door, stepped outside, and felt the morning air fill my lungs. It was cold, but it carried a strange comfort, the kind of comfort that comes when you know your pain has meaning. As the sun rose over the town, I took a deep breath and began walking. The world hadn't changed, but I had. The laughter from the night before no longer stung. It fueled me. Every step I took was a step closer to something they would never see coming, because the man they laughed at was gone. In his place stood a man reborn from silence, armed with patience and guided by purpose. And though no one knew it yet, the first seed of my revenge had already been planted that very night, in the quiet of that room, beneath the weight of humiliation and the fire of dignity. The day he shouted those words is forever burned into my memory. It was a day like any other, but the moment changed everything. He stood in the living room, eyes blazing, voice loud. "You're a shame to this family," he declared. The words struck me harder than any blow I had ever felt. My heart froze. My chest felt tight. I could not breathe for a moment. All the years of giving, all the nights of worry, all the sacrifices I had made seemed to vanish in that instant. Decades of labor, love, and guidance were reduced to nothing. His cruelty was clear, and it cut deeper than any knife. I felt the sting of betrayal wash over me, bitter and raw. My home felt colder than it had in years. My mind raced, trying to understand how the boy I raised could speak with such venom. I looked at him, and I saw no remorse. I saw no recognition of my sacrifices. I saw arrogance, selfishness, and disregard. His pride had replaced respect. His words were not just an insult, they were a declaration that he considered me unworthy, unwanted, and inferior. The man I had nurtured had turned against me. The one I had trusted with my life had become my tormentor. I tried to calm my heart, to steady my emotions. I could not let anger blind me. I had to think. I had to plan. I had to prepare for the moment when truth would outweigh lies. That day, I realized that words could destroy hearts as much as actions. But words also create a path for justice if seen clearly. His insult became the spark for my resolve. The pain was unbearable. I felt the weight of all the years of betrayal pressing on me. Every sleepless night, every long hour of labor, every time I had put him before myself, all of it returned to me as hurt. I wept silently, not for him, but for the broken bond between us. The love I had given freely was met with contempt. My pride was wounded, but my mind sharpened with clarity. I understood then that my silence had ended. I would no longer endure humiliation quietly. The words had opened a door. They had given me reason and courage to act. I realized that truth and dignity could not be surrendered to cruelty. My patience had been tested beyond measure. My trust had been shattered. It was time to reclaim my voice and my respect. I began to gather my thoughts with precision. I remembered each insult, each slight, each moment of disrespect. I made a mental catalog of every betrayal, every act that contradicted the love I had given. I realized that actions left proof, words left scars, and both could be used to restore balance. I knew that to act wisely, I had to choose the right moment. I reflected on the years of raising him. I remembered teaching him how to walk, how to speak, how to care for others. I remembered the nights I stayed awake while he slept, the meals I skipped to feed him first, the clothes I patched to save money for his needs. I had built him up, believed in him, trusted him. And now, the boy I raised declared me a shame. The words echoed in my mind. "You're a shame to this family." Each repetition sharpened my resolve. I could feel the anger simmering, but I also felt clarity. I knew that public humiliation alone was not enough. I needed evidence. I needed proof. I needed the world to see the truth of his actions, not just the venom of his words. I began to plan methodically. I reviewed past incidents where he had lied, cheated, or betrayed trust. I collected records, messages, and witnesses who could confirm my story. I prepared a way to make the revelation undeniable, factual, and clear. I realized that a private confrontation would not suffice. The world had to see his deceit. The festival became the perfect stage. My heart was heavy, but my mind was steady. I knew the path ahead was not easy, but it was necessary. The insult had awakened a fire within me, a fire to restore dignity. I knew that my actions must be precise, careful, and undeniable. This was not revenge for anger, but justice for years of mistreatment. I remembered that respect is earned and disgrace is chosen. He had chosen disgrace. I had chosen to act with honor. I prepared for the day when lies would be exposed and truth would shine. I prepared for the moment when the family, neighbors, and community would see the real story. His words had given me the reason. His cruelty had given me the opportunity. I took time to calm my thoughts before acting. I meditated on patience, clarity, and strategy. I reflected on the difference between retaliation and justice. My heart sought neither malice nor violence. My goal was restoration of truth. My preparation was thorough, each step measured. I knew that a single misstep could allow his lies to survive. The cutting words became a catalyst. I transformed pain into action. I transformed shame into proof. I transformed betrayal into clarity. The insult was no longer just words. It became the key to revealing reality. I felt stronger than I had in years. I felt capable, focused, and ready. I knew that the festival would witness the revelation. I knew the community would see the truth. I knew my dignity would be restored, not with anger, but with proof. I had endured years of disrespect, but the day of reckoning had come. His words had sparked a journey from hurt to justice, from silence to exposure, from shame to honor. That night, after hearing his cruel words, I sat alone in my chair. The house was silent, yet my heart was loud with pain. I stared at the walls that once held laughter, now heavy with emptiness. I thought of my life, the years of work, the endless sacrifices. Every wrinkle on my hands carried a story of labor, of love, of giving. But none of it mattered now. My own blood had called me a shame. I did not sleep that night. My mind replayed every moment like a film I could not stop. I saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders. I remembered the first time he said thank you when he was young and innocent. That child was gone now. In his place stood a man with pride so high it blinded him from love. I felt the ache of betrayal, but also a strange calm inside me. Something within me had shifted. As I sat there, I realized silence had been my prison. I had spent years hiding my hurt behind patience. I believed endurance was strength. But now, I saw it differently. Silence protects the cruel. It allows arrogance to grow. My quiet heart had given him permission to disrespect me. My forgiveness had made him fearless. And that night, I decided the silence would end. I thought about all the times I stayed quiet when he raised his voice. The times I let him insult me, thinking love would change him. The times I swallowed pain to keep peace. Each memory burned now like a scar. I understood that love without boundaries invites destruction. A father must teach, even when his heart bleeds. I had failed to correct him, but I would not fail again. As the hours passed, I began to see everything clearly. His words had not destroyed me. They had awakened me. The man he had become was not the boy I raised. He had been consumed by lies, greed, and pride. But truth was still mine. I had lived a life of honesty and sacrifice. My story was real. His lies were temporary. And one day, truth would expose him. I began to plan quietly. I made no announcements. I did not speak to anyone. I kept my heart still and my mind sharp. I thought of every person he had lied to, every mask he had worn. I thought of the family who still believed his charm. I thought of the festival approaching, a day when everyone would gather, a day when the truth could no longer hide. I knew that moment would be my chance. A festival meant joy, pride, reputation. He cared deeply about his image. He wanted to appear perfect before others. That would be the stage where truth would strike hardest. I would reveal his cruelty, not in anger, but in calm exposure. His own pride would become his undoing. I began to gather everything I needed. I found old letters, bank slips, and messages that showed his lies. I spoke to people who had seen his true face. I recorded their words. I wrote everything down in neat handwriting. I kept the documents in a small brown folder. Every page carried proof of what he had become. Every line carried my quiet strength. There were nights when I doubted myself. I wondered if I was wrong to do this. But then I looked at the bruises on my arms, the pain in my chest, the loneliness in my room, and I remembered his words, "You're a shame to this family." That reminder gave me purpose. That insult became my fire. I realized this was not revenge, it was revelation. It was justice for every parent disrespected by their child. It was the truth finally given a voice. I was not fighting out of hate. I was fighting for dignity. My life had value, my sacrifices had worth, and I would make sure the world saw that. Each morning, I woke up early and reviewed my plan. I imagined the moment, step by step. I pictured the crowd, the faces of relatives and neighbors. I imagined the silence when I spoke. I saw his reaction, his pride collapsing in front of everyone. The thought did not bring me joy. It brought me peace. It was not about humiliation. It was about truth. The days leading up to the festival felt long, heavy, and cold. He went about his life as if nothing had happened. He laughed loudly, bragged proudly, unaware of what was coming. I stayed quiet, moving like a shadow, waiting for the right moment. I acted normal, but inside me, something powerful was growing. My silence was no longer weakness. It was preparation. When I looked at him, I did not see my son anymore. I saw a reflection of arrogance, a mirror of disrespect. The love I once had was buried under his cruelty. I did not wish him harm. I only wished for truth to reach him, even if it broke him first. I wanted him to see the pain he caused, not just to me, but to himself. That festival would not just be my revenge, it would be my freedom. It would be the day I broke the chain of silence. It would be the day I showed that even an old man's truth could shake the walls built by lies. I would speak with calm, not rage. I would speak with proof, not emotion. I would speak once, but it would be enough. As I sat there that night, I whispered to myself that this would be my last silent pain. I would no longer carry guilt for his actions. I would no longer hide the truth out of love. I would no longer let disrespect go unchallenged. I had been quiet for too long. The time had come to let my truth speak for me. Once my mind was clear and my heart steady, I began to gather everything I needed. I was no longer the quiet, broken man who sat in the corner. I had become someone with purpose. My pain had become my strength. My patience had turned into planning. I knew that words alone would not prove anything. I needed evidence, solid, undeniable truth that would speak for itself. I started by collecting small pieces of information. At first, it was just small things, bank records, receipts, and notes that exposed his lies. Each paper, each signature, each number told a part of the story. I placed them neatly inside a folder. I did it quietly, without letting anyone know. I had learned that silence could be a weapon when used wisely. He had built a life of pride and deception. To the world, he looked respectable, well-dressed, confident, charming. But beneath that mask lived a man who had forgotten kindness, who had traded his father's love for false pride. I knew that exposing him publicly would be painful for me too, but it had to be done. The truth had to breathe again. I went through old drawers, letters, and even his old belongings. I found messages he had sent that revealed his selfishness. I found bills that showed how he used the family name for personal gain. Every document was a piece of the puzzle. I organized everything with care, labeling dates and details. I wanted no confusion when the truth was shown. I also spoke quietly with people who had seen his cruelty. Some neighbors had witnessed his anger, his shouting, his disrespect. A few relatives had heard his harsh words, but stayed silent. When I approached them, I did not ask for sympathy. I asked for honesty. I asked them to tell the truth if the time came. Many nodded, ashamed that they had looked away for so long. Each day, I added more to my folder. The weight of it grew heavier, but so did my confidence. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance. It was about showing the world that even a father's silence has limits. It was about reminding everyone that respect is not optional, not even for the elderly. I spent nights reviewing everything I had gathered. My table became a battlefield of papers, photographs, and notes. I worked under the soft light of a lamp, marking details with trembling hands. Sometimes my eyes filled with tears, but I did not stop. My heart was tired, but my will was strong. Each page reminded me of the years I had endured. Each file gave me strength to move forward. The festival was only a few weeks away. It would be the perfect stage, public, proud, and full of witnesses. It was a time when families showed unity, when respect was supposed to shine. I decided that would be the moment to expose him, not to destroy him, but to make him see himself, to make him face the truth he had buried under arrogance. I began to plan the sequence of what I would reveal. I would not scream. I would not curse. I would speak plainly, with proof in hand. I would hold the papers, the photos, the witnesses if needed. I would speak only once, but my truth would echo in every corner of that place. He had called me a shame, but that day, the truth would call him out. I made copies of everything. One folder stayed with me, one went to my lawyer, and another was kept with a trusted relative. I wanted to make sure that even if something happened to me, the truth would not disappear. I had learned long ago that truth must be protected like a treasure. It can be stolen, it can be buried, but it must never be lost. Sometimes at night, I looked at my reflection and wondered what I had become. I was not the man I used to be, soft, forgiving, and patient. But I was not bitter either. I was focused. I was determined. I was a father who had been hurt, but who refused to die in silence. I was ready to speak, ready to reclaim my respect. He still did not know what was coming. He moved through the days with arrogance, mocking me whenever he could. He thought my silence meant weakness. He thought I was too old to fight back. But he was wrong. My silence was not fear, it was strategy. My weakness was not physical, it was emotional, and that emotion had now turned into fire. I watched him talk about success, about family honor, about being the man of the house. Every word he said was built on lies. Every smile he gave to others was a mask. I stayed calm, waiting, storing energy for the day when the truth would strike. I did not want to destroy him, but I wanted him to face himself, to see what he had become. I could feel time moving slowly, pulling me closer to the moment. The folder of truth sat by my bedside like a silent witness. Every time I looked at it, I felt stronger. I felt that justice was near. The weight of it no longer scared me. It comforted me. I was ready for the storm. The days leading up to the festival were filled with quiet purpose. I rehearsed what I would say. I planned how I would present the evidence. I imagined the faces of those who would listen. I could already hear the whispers that would follow. But I was not afraid. Truth never fears light. It only waits for the right moment to shine. And so I waited, patient, calm, and unshaken. Each morning, I looked at the sky and reminded myself that this was not about revenge. It was about peace. It was about setting things right. It was about giving dignity back to a father who had been stripped of it. It was about showing that even old men can stand tall when armed with truth. The festival arrived like every other year, bright and filled with laughter. The entire town gathered, dressed in colors, their faces glowing with joy. Families greeted each other with warmth. Children ran around with sweets, and the sound of music filled the air. But beneath that joy, I carried something no one else could see, a quiet storm, a folder full of truth, and a plan that would end years of humiliation. I stood by the gate, watching people arrive. Relatives came from nearby villages, old friends from far away. Everyone seemed excited to celebrate, including my son. He moved through the crowd like a man of importance, shaking hands, smiling, pretending to be the perfect son. He wore fine clothes, his voice full of charm. He had built his life around lies, but today, those lies would start to fall apart. He had no idea what was coming. To him, I was still the old man who kept quiet, the father too weak to challenge him. I saw him laugh loudly with neighbors, talking about family pride and honor. Those words used to mean something to me, but now they felt hollow. I had spent years teaching him the value of truth, but he had replaced it with arrogance. Today would remind him that no lie can last forever. The festival was held at the community ground, large and open. Decorations hung from every corner, lights shimmered, and the air smelled of food and flowers. People gathered around to sing, to share stories, to celebrate tradition. I walked slowly among them, my folder held close to my chest. My steps were steady, my mind calm. This was not revenge, it was justice. I was not here to destroy him, only to reveal him. When the time came for speeches, everyone gathered near the stage. It was tradition for the head of the family to speak, to remind everyone of values and gratitude. My son was invited to speak before me. He took the microphone with pride, smiling as he looked around. His voice was confident, his words rehearsed. He spoke of unity, respect, and the strength of family bonds. The crowd clapped, unaware of the truth that lay beneath his performance. As he finished, he turned and gestured for me to come forward. It was supposed to be symbolic, a father and son sharing the stage, showing love before everyone. But that symbol had died long ago. I walked up slowly, my heart steady, my hands holding the folder. I could feel eyes on me, curious and warm. They saw me as an old man, humble and kind. None of them knew the story behind my silence. I stood before the crowd and took a deep breath. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. I could hear the sound of drums fading in the background, replaced by silence. I looked around and saw faces I had known all my life, neighbors, friends, and relatives. Then, I looked at my son. He smiled faintly, thinking I was about to praise him. That smile would soon disappear. I began by thanking everyone for being there, speaking slowly and clearly. My voice was not angry, but firm. I said I had something important to share, something about truth, family, and the meaning of respect. People listened closely, sensing the seriousness in my tone. My son's expression began to change. He shifted uneasily, trying to read what was coming next. Then I lifted the folder and held it up for everyone to see. I told them it contained facts, letters, documents, and proofs. Proof of the deception my son had built his life on. Proof of the lies he had told in the name of pride. I did not need to shout. My calmness made every word heavier. The air around us grew still. The laughter faded. Only silence remained. I opened the folder and read the first few lines aloud. Records of money taken in my name, papers signed with lies, messages sent with cruelty. Every word echoed across the ground. Gasps filled the crowd. Whispers started to spread like wind through the trees. My son's face turned pale. He took a step back, his arrogance melting into fear. People who had once praised him now looked at him with shock. I continued, reading enough to let the truth breathe. I did not insult him. I did not add emotion. I only showed proof. Each document was a mirror reflecting his betrayal. The truth, simple and pure, did what years of silence could not. It stripped him of his false image. When I was done, I closed the folder gently. I looked at the crowd and said that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. I told them that a family built on lies will crumble, but truth will always stand. My voice was steady, not trembling. My pain had transformed into peace. My dignity, once buried, was standing tall before everyone. I stepped down from the stage and began walking away. The crowd murmured softly, processing what they had witnessed. My son stood frozen, unable to speak. His hands shook, his face drained of color. For the first time, he looked small, not because I humiliated him, but because truth had made him face himself. He had been unmasked, and the world had seen it. As I walked through the crowd, people stepped aside. Some nodded respectfully, some bowed slightly. They understood now. They saw not an old man, but a father who had carried truth with courage. The festival continued, but its joy had changed. It was no longer about celebration. It was about revelation. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I felt something new. Peace. Not happiness, but peace. The truth had finally spoken. The world knew who I truly was and who he had become. I did not destroy him. I allowed him to destroy himself with his own lies. And for the first time in many years, I felt light again. After that day at the festival, the truth did not fade away. It spread like wind through every corner of our town. People spoke of what they had seen, of what they had heard. My son's name, once spoken with admiration, now carried whispers of shame. Every lie he had built, every mask he had worn, was now falling piece by piece. But this moment, this revelation, had only just begun for me. It was not only about exposing him, it was about finally facing everything I had endured in silence. The days following the festival were heavy. I could feel the change in the air. Some people avoided my son when he passed by. Others looked at me with quiet respect. They understood the weight of what I had done. They saw that an old man had stood up for himself without raising his voice, without violence, without bitterness. I had used truth as my shield and my sword. It had taken me years to realize that truth, when spoken calmly, becomes the most powerful weapon. Inside our house, the silence was thick. My son avoided my eyes. His voice, once loud and arrogant, had lost its confidence. I watched him move around with unease, his pride shattered, his steps uncertain. He had built his strength on lies, and now those lies had crumbled beneath him. I felt no joy in seeing him like this, only a strange peace, a balance that had finally been restored. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers softly after years of noise. Each morning, I sat in the same chair where I had once cried, but now the tears had dried. That chair no longer felt like a place of weakness. It had become a place of reflection. I thought of the long journey that brought me here, from being called a shame to showing the world who truly deserved that title. I did not destroy my son. I revealed him, and in doing so, I freed myself. There were moments when guilt tried to return. A father's heart, no matter how hurt, always remembers love. Sometimes I asked myself if I had gone too far. But then I remembered the nights of humiliation, the words that cut deep, the bruises that told silent stories. I remembered how I sat in darkness, afraid to speak. No, I had not gone too far. I had only taken back what was mine, my dignity, my peace, my self-respect. Days turned into weeks, and the story continued to spread. The proof I had shown became a lesson for many. Parents came to me quietly, some in tears, saying they understood my pain. They said they too had been disrespected, but never found the courage to act. They saw in me a reflection of their own silence. My story gave them strength, and that was when I realized this was never just about me or my son. It was about every old parent who had been forgotten after giving everything. As for my son, his arrogance faded into isolation. Friends stopped visiting him. The community that once praised him now turned away. Even his own children looked at him differently. They had seen the truth in front of everyone. They knew what he had done to his father. Their eyes, once filled with admiration, now held questions and disappointment. The cycle of pride he had lived in was broken. I did not speak to him much after that. There was nothing left to say. He had spoken his cruel words. I had answered with silence and truth. That was enough. Some evenings, I heard him pacing outside my room, as if he wanted to apologize, but couldn't. But an apology given after exposure carries no weight. It's not born from remorse, only from shame. I did not need his words. I needed peace, and I had found it. In the weeks that followed, my health began to decline slightly, but my heart felt lighter. Pain, both emotional and physical, seemed to lose its grip. I had lived long enough to see the truth win, and that was enough for me. I spent more time with my grandchildren. Their innocence reminded me of how my son once was, before pride poisoned his heart. I taught them small lessons, not through lectures, but through stories. They listened quietly, their young eyes filled with respect. During one evening at sunset, I sat outside my house, watching the sky turn orange and gold. It felt like a symbol, the world itself acknowledging my journey. The truth had burned away the darkness, leaving behind a softer, calmer light. I no longer needed revenge. I no longer carried anger. I only carried memory, a memory that spoke of endurance, of courage, of quiet justice. I realized something that day. Revenge fades quickly, but revelation lasts forever. My act at the festival had not just broken his lies, it had become part of the town's story, part of its lesson. People would remember it for years to come. They would remember the old man who stood in front of a crowd, not with anger, but with truth. And they would remember the son who forgot that respect is not a gift, it is an obligation. The festival that year ended differently than any before. People no longer spoke of celebrations and decorations. They spoke of truth and respect. My act had turned joy into reflection, and even though it hurt to expose my own blood, I knew it had to be done. If I had stayed silent, the next generation would think cruelty was acceptable. Now, they had seen what courage looked like. I ended each day with a quiet prayer, not for punishment, not for revenge, but for peace. I prayed that my son would learn, that he would one day understand what respect truly means. I did not wish him misery, I wished him awareness, because awareness is the beginning of redemption, and maybe, someday, he would find it. That moment of truth was not loud, but it changed everything. It gave power to silence. It turned humiliation into honor. It turned fear into freedom. I had waited too long to defend myself, but when I finally did, I did it with dignity. And that made all the difference. After the festival, silence fell upon our home like never before. The laughter that once filled the rooms vanished completely. Even the air felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of truth that could no longer be hidden. My son stopped speaking to anyone for days. He stayed inside his room, curtains closed, afraid to face the world that had seen his lies unfold. The man who once shouted at me without fear now avoided his own reflection. Pride had been stripped from him completely. The neighbors had already started talking. Everywhere I went, whispers followed. Some people pitied me, some respected me, and others simply stared in disbelief. They couldn't understand how a father could find the strength to expose his own son. But those who truly knew pain understood my reason. They knew I hadn't done it out of hatred, but out of necessity. There are moments in life when truth must speak, even if it burns everything around it. And mine had burned quietly, but deeply. When I stepped out to buy groceries, old friends stopped me on the street. They placed their hands on my shoulder and said nothing. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke of understanding. The story had reached far and wide, and while my son hid from shame, I faced the world with calm. People now saw me not as a broken man, but as one who stood tall again. For years, I had carried invisible wounds. Now, the world could finally see them, and more importantly, they could see that I survived. Inside the house, things were different. His wife looked at me with guilt and sadness. She had known parts of his behavior, but never believed it would go that far. His children avoided eye contact for the first few days, confused and hurt by what they had witnessed. But slowly, they began spending more time around me again. They sat near me while I had tea. They asked quiet questions about the past. They wanted to understand. And I answered, not with bitterness, but with truth. They needed to know that respect, once lost, takes a lifetime to rebuild. My son, however, could not face them. He left early for work and returned late at night, as if running from the shadow of his own actions. But even at work, things had changed. People there had heard the story. His proud posture and loud voice could no longer hide his guilt. Some colleagues confronted him, others distanced themselves completely. The reputation he had spent years building collapsed within days. Everything he valued, status, image, admiration, was gone. I did not smile when I heard of his struggles. I did not feel joy watching his pride crumble. The truth had already done its job. My purpose was never revenge. It was revelation. I wanted him to see what he had become. I wanted him to understand that no matter how powerful a man becomes, cruelty toward one's parents is a wound that never heals. And as the days passed, I could see the realization slowly settling in his eyes. There were nights when I could hear him crying softly in his room. It was strange to hear those sounds from a man who once had nothing but anger in his voice. The same man who had shouted at me, humiliated me, and called me a shame was now drowning in the silence of his own guilt. I didn't go to him. I didn't offer comfort. Some lessons are not taught with words. They are taught by time. He needed to face his own reflection, to understand the cost of his cruelty. In the community, people began to treat me differently. They invited me to gatherings, asked for my advice, and listened when I spoke. Respect, which had once disappeared from my life, returned stronger than ever. Even the younger generation, who had once laughed at old traditions, began to look at me with admiration. My story had become a lesson passed quietly between families, a reminder that disrespect toward elders is not strength, but decay. As the months passed, my son's life continued to unravel. His arrogance had cost him friends, his lies had cost him trust, and his pride had cost him peace. He had everything a man could want, but now none of it mattered. Wealth could not erase shame. Success could not rebuild dignity. He began to understand what I had known all along, that truth may come slowly, but it never fails to arrive. I watched him from a distance. He walked differently now, shoulders lower, steps heavier. His eyes no longer shone with pride, but with quiet regret. Sometimes, when we crossed paths in the hallway, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but said nothing. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he just didn't know how. But I didn't need his words anymore. The apology I needed had already been written in his downfall. One afternoon, I found him sitting outside on the steps, staring into the distance. He looked tired, defeated, smaller than I had ever seen him. I didn't say anything. I simply walked past him. The silence between us said everything that words never could. He knew. I knew. And that was enough. The town eventually moved on from our story, as towns always do. But the memory of that day at the festival remained alive. People remembered the old man who stood up and spoke the truth. They remembered the lesson behind it. Even years later, when someone spoke of family, they often said, "Respect your elders. You never know when silence will speak louder than pride." In my heart, there was no hatred left, only stillness. I had done what needed to be done. I had protected my dignity and restored my peace. My son had lost his honor, but he had gained understanding. And maybe that was the greatest gift I could have given him, the chance to see his own reflection through the eyes of truth. The fallout had destroyed him, yes, but it had also freed me. I was no longer the silent father sitting in the shadows of disrespect. I had become a man of truth, a man who chose dignity over silence. And though the world moved on, I carried peace within me. The kind of peace that comes only when justice is done. Not by law, not by force, but by courage. The days after the revelation slowly turned into weeks, and life began to move forward, though nothing truly returned to the way it was before. My son remained distant, lost in the silence he had once forced upon me. The house that had once echoed with his voice now felt strangely quiet. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from happiness. It was the peace that follows a storm, where everything stands still and only truth remains. I had exposed him, but I had also freed myself. For the first time in years, I could breathe without fear or shame. Each morning, I rose early and walked outside to feel the cold air. The sun took its time rising, but when it did, it felt softer, kinder, almost as if the world itself had forgiven me for the years I spent hiding in silence. I would sit on the old wooden chair near the gate, the same one I had built with my own hands long ago. From there, I watched the world wake up. The neighbors greeted me with respect, nodding as they passed. Children waved from the street. Even the smallest gestures felt like healing. The wound left by my son's betrayal was still there, but it no longer bled. It had turned into a scar, a reminder of everything I had endured and overcome. I realized that scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof of survival. They show that we lived through pain and refused to let it define us. That understanding became my quiet comfort. My son rarely spoke to me after that day. When he did, his words were short and heavy, without the arrogance they once carried. He had changed, though not in the way he expected. He had lost much: friends, pride, reputation. But perhaps he had gained something too. Perhaps, in the wreckage of his downfall, he had finally discovered humility. I hoped so, because even after everything, a father's heart never truly stops hoping. I never spoke of forgiveness, nor did I demand an apology. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a gift you give someone. It's the peace you give yourself. I had already found mine when I spoke the truth. I didn't need to hear him say, "I'm sorry." Life had already delivered that message for him in ways words never could. Every time he looked away in shame, every time he walked past me quietly, I knew he understood what his cruelty had cost him. One evening, the town held another gathering. This time, it was not a festival, but a community event to honor elders. They invited me to speak, not because I was the loudest or the strongest, but because I was the man who had chosen dignity over silence. As I stood before them, I didn't talk about my pain or my revenge. I spoke about truth, the kind of truth that doesn't destroy but frees you. I told them that silence may seem peaceful, but when it hides injustice, it becomes a prison. And when you finally break that silence, you set not just yourself free, but others too. People listened quietly, their eyes reflecting understanding. Some nodded, some wiped tears. When I finished, they stood and clapped softly, not out of excitement, but out of respect. That moment told me everything I needed to know. My story had not been in vain. My suffering had meaning. I had turned humiliation into a lesson, and that lesson now lived beyond me. After the event, a few younger men approached me. They said my courage had changed how they saw their own fathers. They promised to speak with more respect, to listen more carefully, to never take love for granted. I smiled at them and said nothing more. Words had done their part. The rest would be shown through action. When I returned home that night, the moon hung low and the house was quiet as always. My son sat in the living room, staring at nothing. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger left between us, only the weight of understanding. I walked past him slowly, not with pride, but with peace. He didn't follow, but I could feel his gaze on my back. Maybe he wanted to speak, maybe not. It didn't matter anymore. I had done what I needed to do. As days turned into months, I started spending more time with his children. They reminded me of innocence, of how life begins pure before pride poisons it. They listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I taught them small things: how to plant seeds, how to repair small tools, how to stay humble no matter how high they rise. I wanted them to know what their father had forgotten. That respect is the strongest inheritance a man can give or receive. Eventually, I decided it was time to leave the house. I gave my belongings to the grandchildren, the things that carried memories. My books, my tools, my old watch, all went to them. I wanted to leave behind more than material things. I wanted to leave behind lessons. My son received nothing, not out of spite, but out of principle. He had already taken too much from me. My peace, my trust, my pride. What he needed now could not be given. It had to be earned. On the morning I left, I walked through the house one last time. Every wall, every chair, every corner held a memory, some painful, some beautiful. I touched the doorframe as I stepped outside, whispering a silent goodbye. I did not look back. I had spent too many years looking behind me, trying to fix what was already broken. Now, it was time to walk forward. The road stretched before me, long and quiet. The air was cold, but I didn't feel lonely. I had myself, my peace, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had not allowed cruelty to define me. People talk about revenge as if it is anger. But true revenge is peace. True revenge is walking away with your dignity untouched while the guilty are left to face themselves. And so, that's what I did. I walked away, not as a defeated father, but as a man who found strength in truth. My exit was not loud, not dramatic. It was silent, steady, and full of meaning. Because sometimes the most powerful ending is not one filled with noise, but one filled with calm. I had stood for myself. I had revealed the truth. And now I was free. Now, as the years have passed and the house stands quieter than ever, I often find myself sitting by the window, thinking about everything that has happened. The days of noise, arguments, and heartbreak feel like a distant storm now. What remains is calm, a calm that took years to earn and pain to understand. I no longer carry anger toward my son. The anger burned out long ago, leaving only ashes of lessons. And in those ashes, I found something far more powerful than revenge. I found peace. When I look back, I don't see my story as one of pain anymore. I see it as a story of awakening. There was a time when I believed silence was strength, that enduring cruelty without complaint was dignity. But life taught me otherwise. Silence can sometimes protect the wrong person. It allows disrespect to grow like weeds until it covers every good thing left. I realized that standing up for myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. For if a man doesn't defend his dignity, no one else will. I often think about the day my son called me a shame, and how those words shattered me at first. But now, I see them differently. Those words didn't destroy me. They freed me. They forced me to face reality, to see my son not as the boy I raised, but as the man he had become. That realization was painful, but it gave me clarity. It made me understand that love cannot blind you to truth. Real love must carry truth, even when it hurts. When I spoke at the festival, I did not realize I was writing the final chapter of my pain. The truth I revealed that day became my salvation. It didn't just expose him, it healed me. For years, I had been drowning quietly in humiliation, and that single act became the breath of freedom I had long been denied. I didn't speak out to humiliate him. I spoke to restore the balance that life had taken from me. And in doing so, I found my strength again. Sometimes, in the evenings, I still see my son from afar. He walks past the house on his way somewhere, never looking in, never stopping. His steps are slower now, his shoulders lower. He has learned humility through loss. I do not hate him. In truth, I feel a quiet sadness for him. He had everything: a father's love, a home, respect, and he lost it all by choosing pride over kindness. That is the cost of arrogance. It always leaves you alone. There are moments when I imagine him coming to me, maybe sitting beside me, saying what he never said. I'm sorry. But I know those words may never come. And that's all right, because I have already forgiven him in my heart. Forgiveness is not for the one who hurt you. It's for the one who wants to sleep in peace. I have chosen peace over bitterness. Bitterness eats away the soul. Peace rebuilds it. I now live simply. My days are slow, but they are full of meaning. I wake up with no fear, no anger, no regret. The mornings are quiet companions. The nights are soft and kind. Sometimes the grandchildren visit. They bring laughter into the house again, the kind I thought I'd lost forever. They don't speak about the past. They don't need to. Their presence itself is healing. I teach them small lessons, how to respect, how to listen, how to stay humble. I tell them that strength is not in raising your voice, but in carrying truth with grace. They listen with wide eyes, their innocence untouched by pride. And as I watch them play in the yard, I feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, through them, the cycle will break. That they will grow up knowing love without cruelty, pride without arrogance, and respect without condition. In their laughter, I see redemption, not for me, but for the family name that once felt stained. Sometimes I think of the man I used to be before all this happened. The quiet father, afraid to speak, hiding his pain behind tired smiles. I almost don't recognize him anymore. Life has changed me. Pain has shaped me. Truth has strengthened me. I am no longer the man who accepts cruelty in silence. I am the man who stood up for himself, not with fists or rage, but with truth. And that truth became my legacy. In my old age, I have learned that revenge doesn't heal. It only satisfies the moment. But revelation, truth, and courage, they heal the soul. What I did was not revenge. It was redemption. Redemption for all the years I allowed disrespect to exist under my roof. Redemption for every time I told myself to stay quiet. Redemption for every parent who still sits in silence, thinking their pain doesn't matter. Now, when people pass by my home, they don't see a weak old man. They see someone who found courage when no one else would. They see the strength that comes from pain. They see the power of truth. I don't crave their praise, but I am grateful for their understanding. My story is not one of hate. It's one of survival. And survival, in its purest form, is victory. At night, when the world sleeps and the wind whispers through the trees, I close my eyes and thank life. Not for the pain, but for the lessons it brought. Every scar on my soul has a story, and every story has a purpose. I thank life for teaching me that no insult, no betrayal, no cruelty can truly destroy a man who knows his worth. My worth was never defined by my son's words. It was defined by how I rose after they were spoken. So now, I sit here, at peace with everything. My son lives with his choices. I live with my peace. Time has softened the wounds, but not the memory. And that memory is enough to keep me wise. If anyone ever asks me what I learned from it all, I would tell them this. Silence may protect love for a while, but truth protects dignity forever. He once said I was a shame, a curse, a burden. But in the end, I became something far greater. I became the lesson he will never forget.